All right, good afternoon, folks. Some last things set up here. I'm going to be talking about the UNH stock. That's the United Health Group stock. And as some of you saw, I was interested in it because of the recent event with the CEO assassination. And I thought it was interesting just because, I had known before that they were the largest health insurance provider in the country a few years ago. And so I figured that was probably relevant, and if nothing for an educational purpose, I thought it would be interesting to look at the business and, why it clearly got the attention of the assassin that it did. So I'm going to pull up my notes here from the look I took at it over the weekend and let you know what I think about this company as an investment. So first, let me just get it posted on X now. All right. So I'm going to share my screen here. All right. And so if we look at the recent price movement, now when I got these notes down, it was down 10% or so. You can take a more recent look at where the price is. Let's see. I think it's bounced up a little since I got that down, but not much. If we look at where it is more recently, let me pull up a more. So if we look at where it has been recently, right, it was right here, and then it went down quite a bit. So clearly, people feel like the attention that this news event got is probably not good for the company long term. And so, this is a drop of about 10% here. I would say it's probably close to like 7 or 8% now. If we look at for a longer period of time, however, it's still much higher than it was 5 years ago. If we look at the long-term history of the price, look at that. These are the long-term returns of private healthcare in America. It may speak somewhat to why the assassin felt the way that he did. So another thing that's worth noting is that the way the business works is they are the United Health Group. So there's the United Health proper, the original insurance company. They had a merger in 2012 with Optum, and so the group also has subsidiary businesses under Optum. They have a provider business. They have a technology solutions one, and then they have a pharmacy. And so there's it's a mixture of an insurance and non-insurance business, and so there's like a CEO for each of those subsidiary businesses. It was the CEO of the insurance business specifically that was assassinated in New York. The CEO of the entire group was not. So it also says something that the insurance was targeted. So if we look at where United Health has been over the last decade, and I've got annual results. So the year-to-date ones for 2024 aren't displayed here, but we do see that it's consistent revenue growth from 2014 to 2023, and in the course of that decade, it's nearly tripling. So doing pretty well in terms of growth for what was already a pretty large company. If we look at what their market share was with commercial insurance starting at that period and up to 2022, we see that they were the market share leader at that time, but also that it hasn't changed a whole lot. And in fact, their market share is somewhat smaller. So they went from 16% of the commercial health insurance market to 14%. And commercial is basically just referring to private healthcare. It's not referring to the Medicare Advantage system or other other markets. So this is mainly what people think of, but this isn't the entire health insurance market by any measure. So that's just important to keep in mind. And oh wait, I forgot to change my. I forgot to change my screen share. Okay. Yeah. So this is revenue growth right here. And this is the market share, right? So it was higher in 2014, it's lower in 2022, but both times they were the leader. None of the major competitors gained particularly more. So it's the market share isn't changing too much, and this is again just commercial. It's not entire health insurance or healthcare market. And so if we look at where there are different types of health insurance segments, how those did, we see more of the growth was in the Medicare and retirement markets and the community and state markets. So these, if we look at these figures here, each of these basically tripled in their revenue from 2014 to 2013. While if you look at where they were in 2014, this was one of their biggest revenue contributors here. This is the market, the employer and individual that they're dominating. This one is the one that really took off. We also look at the global. This only grew a little too. So these two segments did not grow as much. If you look at what the compound annual growth rate of the employer and individual market for them was 2014 to 2013, that's a CAGR of about 5%. So about 2.5% is suggesting that they have pricing power to keep up with inflation. And then with a somewhat consistent market size, I don't expect their market share is going to be exactly the same every single year. So it probably fluctuates, between the mid to low double digits each year. If you imagine that market grows over time as well, then they can grow, get some growth that way. But this is where most of the insurance growth was. When we look at how much that revenue is growing, a lot of it had to do with the fact that they penetrated these markets more. So, a lot more growth of the healthcare market from like the Medicare Advantage. That really was more of a novelty in the last decade. In the aftermath of the Affordable Care Act. That's where they had a lot of their growth. And so, but really, I think the story of their growth isn't just one of insurance, even though people mostly think of it as an insurance company. But like I said, it's in their non-insurance. So if we look at the revenue breakdown from 2014 to 2023, we see that premium. So this is insurance. Did grow quite a bit. Again, most of it was due to penetrating the other markets, but we see that they're non-insurance businesses, so the different services, products they sell, as well as the investment income from their portfolio, because insurance companies have to keep usually portfolio bonds to provide them sufficient coverage of their insurance liabilities. These also grew, right? So these grew by several multiples, right? So even though this is, from the insurance business grew from 2014 to 2023, about 2.5 times, I guess. So more than double, less than triple. Their services tripled. Products, but that's about, I want to say, like 9 times, or almost no more like 10 times actually. Yeah, 4.2 billion to 42 billion, so about 10 times. Then investment income also grows quite a bit as their portfolio grows. So significant, disproportionate share of the revenue growth came from the non-insurance business. And then if we look at earnings, the earnings actually did much better than the revenue growth. And so we see in 2014, it's about 5.6 billion, gets to almost 22.4 billion. So, we're looking at about 4x in earnings for what was less than a 3x in revenue. And there's a few things that explain this. One is that if we look at their operating margins, Optum's, so this is the non-insurance business. These are the things I mentioned before, and this is their insurance. Their operating margins better. So every time they grow revenue here, they make more money because the revenue is high, right? So UnitedHealthcare, their margin has been pretty consistent. It looks like 5.8 to 5.8, and this is lower for most of this segment here. That is Optum, right? They actually have the consolidated results for Optum. So if we look at Optum overall, 6.9 to 7. The operating margins are pretty consistent over time. So, but as this became a larger share of the revenue, we see that the overall operating margin improves, which means that earnings grow faster than revenues. And then, even if margins were to remain the same, which they did here, if as long as revenues are more than expenses, which is how the operating margin is determined. It's your operating income is revenue minus operating expenses, and then whatever that ratio is the operating margin. If revenues are bigger and they grow, let's say 10%, and then operating expenses also grow 10%, you have earnings growth higher than 10% because the positive number, the revenue, grew more than the negative number, the expenses. So that's just simple math right there. But if that's occurring while you also are growing your higher margin business units, then that'll lead to significant earnings growth as well. So, if we go back to revenue real quick, right? This alone is pretty impressive. Companies there aren't very many companies that make over $100 billion in revenue even today. And in 2014, it was a different task entirely to do that. And so to get to almost 400 billion and have that kind of earnings growth is impressive. But it also speaks to how much money is on the table here and why some of this is controversial. So we look here about exactly what they do with these earnings. It's basically how the cash has been returned to shareholders. Blue bar represents buybacks. Green bar represents dividends. As you can tell, as the earnings steadily grew, the dividend distribution steadily grew. Most companies like to have a pretty consistent dividend policy, whereas the buybacks have been more of a fluctuation. So the company is also part of their ability to penetrate some of these other markets, these other insurance markets, as well as grow their non-insurance business, has been able to take their this ecosystem that they started to build through the merger of UnitedHealthcare and Optum, and then add to it to give it more features, more revenue opportunities, more operating efficiencies that can occur when you have a nice vertically integrated system like that. And so some years they're doing more M&A, and if they spend cash on acquiring new businesses and adding it to either UnitedHealthcare or Optum, they're going to spend less on buybacks that year. And when they don't see any M&A opportunities, they buy back more shares, which mathematically is similar to just like doing some M&A by reducing the number of shares. Long-term holders of the business own a bigger stake of United Health going forward. So that's some of the idea behind that. They balance between those things. Now, if we look at what earnings were in 2023, 22.4 billion. So we see a slight majority of the earnings in 2023 went toward buybacks and dividends, and not quite as much of it reinvested into the business. If we look at there's some other things in how the earnings have been. Technically 2024 so far has been less of an earning year, but not from the operations, but more so because they had to record a loss on a subsidiary that they sold off for less than they bought it for. So it's been kind of a flat year for them. This has been the one year where earnings may not actually experience year-over-year growth, but so it to me it creates questions as to how much some of the growth that we've seen over previous years could continue to persist. Because however great the business is, if we go back to what the revenue is, right? I said there aren't very many companies that make over 100 billion in revenue. There certainly aren't many that make over 300 billion in revenue. Let me do a quick search. Top 100 companies by revenue. Let's just do a quick search of that. Okay, so let's share this tab real quick. So this is companiesmarketcap.com. So you see here, these are the companies that do it, right? United Health is the 8th largest company, if measured by revenue. I think among the ones that are publicly traded. And let's talk about American companies. It's 1, 2, 3, 4. It's the 5th largest, right? So this is one of the biggest companies in the country. The thing you could say, just the nature of being so big is that it's easy to have a target on its back. But that is the challenge: is the larger a business grows, whatever it does, whether it's retailer, whether it's even essentially a mutual fund that exists as a C corp like Berkshire Hathaway, whether it's Apple, CVS Health, whether it's an oil company, whether it's a search engine, whatever. It's very difficult to grow at this level because usually when people get meteoric returns from a stock, it's because they got in while it was a small cap and they rode it all the way into becoming a large cap. And usually the way the math works on there is those companies grow their earnings by capturing some of the existing GDP, at large rates. So, if their earnings growth is, let's say, 20% year over year, and they do that for years and years, they're capturing more GDP at a rate of 20%. Now, U.S. GDP typically grows around 2% on average. So, as you expand into that to the size of an economy, there's less for you to capture, and so your ability to grow is going to depend a lot more on what economic growth rates are, and whatever else you can find to be a new revenue opportunity, and that gets hard to do. There's only so many people who are going to need health insurance. There's only so much money to be made on that, and you basically have to start going into a different type of business, under the same management. At that point, you have to get extremely creative, right? You can't just maximize what you were already doing when you were a small cap. You have to create brand new things, and that's not easy to do. So, and even if you look at, where a lot of tech companies are experiencing rapid growth from generative AI, like Google, for example, a lot of that comes from the fact that the potential of generative AI is such that they can reduce existing costs for businesses. So there's, a cash value for that. So, if you quadrupling your revenues means that companies all across America are going to spend, 20% less on their operating expenses. I don't know if that's the actual estimate, but I'm just, pointing that out. You get to eat that. That's the value you provide, but you're not necessarily creating a whole lot of new stuff, right? But you are sort of capturing GDP that was being spent. Those operating expenses were being spent on something else, some other type of product that a different business was providing, and you are capturing that. The actual new stuff that is created from it, is probably not all that large. And there are very few large caps that are in a position to do it. And to the extent that we've seen larger mega caps in a position to do that. They've been the tech companies. Now, example of a company that was using AI was United Health. The AI was being integrated to increase the rate of claims denial, but also to improve the speed of certain claims processing so that nurses and other staff could do paperwork more efficiently. And so even claims that were being approved were being done faster. This reduced costs because then you don't need to hire as much, and it also it reduces the I think some of the skill and competency burden. So if you have staff turnover and you have to train them on how to do things again, if you have AI simplifying the process a bit, and that's less you have to teach the new employee. And so there are those improvements as well. But that's more of a cost reduction thing. Was it necessarily leading United Health as an insurer to better, to actual more value, to more upside, that sprinkles into the economy? Not sure we've had quite enough time to see that yet. Most of what I understand was being done was it was a matter of cost reduction. So as far as what we can expect about moose, yeah, it's always a conspiracy. As far as what we can expect about the business going forward, if we go back, my notes here. Overall, I don't think I'm terribly worried about this. I expect it'll still achieve some growth, but if we look at what that this earnings growth rate was, I don't know if we could realistically expect a 4x of the earnings again. I think more likely is it would be something more along the lines of gradual, something like 2x in the span of a decade, right? So just more going along with the typical returns of the market. Now, if it's 2x, that's still about earnings growth of 7 or 8% a year. That's better than GDP growth rate or the inflation rate, however you want to look at that. But the way I see it is, so one thing is in the Medicare, so the AMA noted that UNH has 14% market share in commercial insurance, but they have 42% of the Medicare Advantage market. So this is where they don't classify this as Medicare Advantage, but I would think like this is where they were thriving. The expansion into that market, their domination, is what led this to this. And you have to ask, how likely are they to gain more market share than that? They could get 50%, 60%, but that's not nearly as much upside as, say, going from 10% to 40%, right? Because that's a 4x. I don't know if they had 10% here, but and also you have to ask, how much is the Medicare Advantage market going to grow like it did over there? It was newer a decade ago. It is lessening now, so they were capturing market share in a new market. Can they repeat that again over the next decade? I have doubts. And when we look at where they were, in this market, the commercial market, which was their employer and individual results, and you could also maybe look at global as part of it as well. Essentially a market that they saturated as much as they could. Look at how much it grew, right? They had a CAGR of about 5% there. So if we assume that revenue grows, more like in the 5% range, so this is sort of giving them pricing power for inflation and maybe some additional improvements in revenue opportunities that they can gradually tack on as new insurance opportunities form. I think one thing AI will allow them to do is provide, I think all insurance companies will be able to do this, is provide better data-driven insurance products so that they can have more versatility for customers. And that I think that creates more sales opportunities. So more ways in which they can compartmentalize insurance coverage and then have different pricing options for that. Because AI will be able to do an underwriting model with more flexibility than I think human beings. But just when you think of what's already possible with them, and in these insurance companies, UNH has, because it has market share, it has the biggest pool of not only insurance data, but also patient data from its the ecosystem has of providers, pharmacists, and then of course with their insurance. So that they have a lot of different layers here, patient and customer data that they can use to train AI, probably get more predictive and efficient results than other health insurance companies. Yeah, the stock price did reduce after the killing, so I don't think it was tremendously lower, but it's been down about, I think, about 8% since the killing happened. So, I think if we assume that there's still more room to grow their non-insurance business, earnings growth more in the upper single-digit range seems likely, and I think you also have to weigh some of the long-term risks. Namely, I think if we look here, the Biden administration sued to prevent UNH's acquisition of a senior home and hospice care business. Now, this is something I've looked at before as well, mainly as it comes to REITs, real estate investment trusts. So basically, the real estate investments that pay dividends that some people like. There are some of those REITs that focus specifically on senior housing and medical care properties, and they collect rent off of that. And those can be pretty lucrative businesses, and I expect those would have a lot more earning potential in the future as we have an aging population and those people will need a place to stay. There's going to be more demand for that type of real estate in the coming decades. And I think United Health attempt to acquire such a business reflects the exact kind of novel M&A they would want to do to broaden their ecosystem, right? Think about what they have now with the insurance business, the provider business. So these are providers, doctors and clinics, the pharmacy business, add senior housing to that ecosystem. You can create a lot of business efficiencies with that kind of medical ecosystem. And so it's something that they're not doing now, but if they could get a good footprint in that is something that could defy what the expectations are about their growth potential. But this just happened in November. The Biden administration sued to prevent the acquisition, and Attorney General Merrick Garland characterized it as within here. The Justice Department will not hesitate to check unlawful consolidation and monopolization in the healthcare market that threatens to harm vulnerable patients, their families, and healthcare workers. And this isn't something that, considering the move was made in November after the election, that's done for political brownie points. This represents some of the I think, organic hesitance to allow companies like United Health to grow more. So I think, the news event kind of is a cartoonish way to shed light on it, but there's a lot of controversy in this industry. And I think every company has political and regulatory risks just by virtue of the fact that the law is the law and they can say whatever. And, any law that changes could affect you. But I think there is much more pressure long term for the law to turn against. Now, the election did just conclude. It's a Republican administration coming in. Historically, they are not as hostile to businesses like that. So that's that's not as much a concern. But I will highlight that in their most recent financial report, United Health reported $299 billion in assets. $106 billion of that is goodwill. So the goodwill is the premium they pay to book value of the companies they acquire. So that reflects just how much they like to engage in M&A to grow. If they're getting resistance to this, that hurts the growth assumptions. And I think one thing that's maybe potentially confusing is that, or it's hard to know what to predict here. With Robert F. Kennedy Jr. going to be heading the Department of Health and Human Services. Now, that could be good or bad. It's really hard to say because, on the one hand, he's made it very clear he wants to go after big pharma, get rid of chronic illnesses that create, a lot of new sales opportunities in we'll say just the private medical industry overall, not just insurance. One benefit here is that it reduces costs of medication, and so that can be more business opportunities for United Health because the higher the costs, um, the more that will strain their margins and also just deter sales because they have to price some of that in themselves. So reducing costs can be good for them, but also if he bans a lot of medication, or reduces like the terms in which they're covered under Medicare or Medicaid, that could also make it harder for them to have as many product sales. Like we saw before, if you look at how much the products part of the business grew, right? It went from 4.2 billion to 42 billion. Does that mean there's less sales here? It's kind of a mixed bag, and we don't know exactly how that's going to affect it. So there's a lot to consider here, and I think for folks hoping to get a good return on a stock like UNH, they need to make sure that the price reflects the more modest case scenario so that they can get the upside for free. Right now, I think UNH is priced for the upside. So if I look at this, right now the forward PE ratio is about, I want to say probably 21, 22. Management has been guiding for 13 to 16% long-term earnings growth. So, I would want a PE ratio of 10. I wouldn't want basically the price to be about half of what it is now before I bought it, because we're getting a premium to a mega cap. And again, I've said before, it is hard for mega caps to grow generally because of the limits of an economy's GDP. And this is a mega cap that has, a lot of people shooting at dirty looks, as was recently manifested through the assassination. So that's what I think about it now. It may not be the worst company to own, but I don't think it'd be realistic to assume it can have the same kind of growth opportunities that it had a decade ago. So let me see what Sean said. It is true they made money by denying claims. Well, that's just reducing costs. That's not really making money. They're already getting the revenue from the insurance, unless you want to say that reporting higher earnings means they make more money. But, we talk about like actual revenue growth, like earnings remain fixed, but you have an increase in revenues because you have some kind of new product, some kind of new value add. That's a different thing. Every insurance company tries to deny claims. That's just a standard part of the model, right? When we talk about growth, we want to think, can the revenues actually increase over time? And I think that's where there's a big question mark on this company. You want to get Ozempic? That's interesting coming from them. Or do you want the regulators to come after Ozempic? Help me understand that, because I don't think you would want to take Ozempic. Based on what I know of you, Shane, that seems like something you would, almost seems like you would scoff at the idea of such a drug even existing. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong. I need to default to this one. I don't know how legible that was. Oh well. So yeah. Oh, you said you're kind of fat. Well, the simple solution to that is to eat less. I used to be about 190 pounds. These days I'm more like 155. And the biggest changer there was I just ate less food. I focused on eating things that I liked, that made me satisfied, and I just stuck to it. I also would actively tell people, like, oh, do you want this? And I would say, no, I'm on a strict diet. I'm only eating XYZ. And so telling people about it kind of forced myself to keep by it, because I was, obviously I could be seen to be breaking my own rules very easily. So I did that for a couple of years. My attitude toward eating changed. Now I eat more of what I feel like, but I'm much more used to keeping it in control, and having seen just how easy it is to get weight under control by eating less. I check myself on the scale. If I see my weight getting too high, I'll eat a bit less. for a couple of days until it goes down again. And I just go through cycles like that. There are people who will say, oh, you need to eat 3 meals every day. If you eat less for a day, that's bad for you. Well, I think what was bad for me was being 190 pounds and listening to that. If you have a day where you eat a meal and a half, that is not the worst thing in the world. Our bodies did not evolve with the expectation that we would have 3 meals of food every single day of our lives. It's okay if we eat a bit less some days, especially if it gets us to a body weight that they would have been more used to. So, yeah, I think Ozempic is the kind of thing that would certainly provoke backlash against the for-profit medical industry, just because the alternative to that is eating less food. Like, there are not a lot of medical issues where you think, well, instead of taking the pill, what can be done? What's the fix to this? It's as simple as don't put as much food in. And obesity rates being what they are is a relatively recent thing. So we know that this isn't inevitable. We know that this is largely an artificial phenomenon that's going on. But that means we can do something about it if we want to. But when I think about it from an investing point of view, right, it sounds almost like I'm just speaking derisively of people's eating habits. But really, my focus is here. If I'm an investor and I'm putting money in something that's going to depend on pills like Ozempic doing well, to me, it's a big risk to the investment if all people have to do is the light bulb has to go off. Oh, I just need to eat less food. I don't think it takes much for that necessarily to go off. And, there's really nothing you can do to save your investment, right? If you buy something like Eli Lilly, which shot up in price because of Ozempic at the peak, and then people, there's a big public movement to take care of it. Well, and people will say, I've heard a lot of people say, oh, people can't help how much they eat. It's not much we can do about it. But we actually, when I say we, I mean America actually banned alcohol for a period of time. Right? They amended the Constitution to ban alcohol. It's difficult to amend the Constitution. Try getting that done today. But they actually did that for a period. And alcohol is an addictive substance. Alcohol is the thing that had a deep cultural background, to antiquity. But people realized that there was a social cost to how easily available alcohol became. So a lot of the foods that make us fat are now easily available over the last 50 to 60 years. It was much easier to take the advancements of the Industrial Revolution and mass produce alcohol. And, it led to a lot more alcoholics. It led to a lot more men beating their wives and their children. And the feminists of the time, the feminist movement was largely tied to the temperance movement, led to them saying, hey, we need to get rid of alcohol. And so there's a lot less, I think there were long-term effects of lower rates of alcohol consumption as a result of prohibition, even though it eventually got phased out. And so my point is people can have these cultural awakenings. It's just a matter of when it happened, right? Decades passed before the temperance movement succeeded in banning prohibition. We might have Ozempic for a decade or two. The question is, do you want to make your investments betting on the time period being long enough for you to benefit? I would want to invest money in a way that it isn't subject to something like that. The good or the service that is provided by the business is just generally going to, it has a certain quality to it that people aren't going to wake up one day and realize, oh, we have been running society wrong and we need to stop using this good or service. So, interestingly, I know that you're kind of joking, but I had talked to people who are not joking. So there's just still some value in me bringing it up. I won't put words in your mouth, Sean. So if you say you're kind of joking, cool. But I do know that some people are not joking. And they actually believe these things. And they actually believe that Ozempic, for example, is something that the government, like Medicare and Medicaid, should cover the cost of it so that people can have access to the drug. And I feel like there's a lot of potential for political backlash to that. And part of the alliance between big pharma and the federal regulators is due to disgust of that very dynamic. And I look at having federal money go toward something like Ozempic as like giving a tax credit to smokers for smoking, for buying cigarettes. They have to pay taxes on those cigarettes, right? So realistically, there should not be a federal subsidy for things like Ozempic and other semaglutides or whatever they're called. I don't remember the basic name of the drug, but realistically, if we're applying the same logic as is done with smoking, cigarette, other tobacco products, there should be publicly imposed costs, almost like a tariff, put on things that cause higher obesity rates. But that's not the response folks are getting. So we just have to wait until it gets to some kind of breaking point that people don't want it. And maybe we're already there. Maybe it will not take long. My point being, I would not want to have my money invested where that's a risk always looming around the corner. So yeah. Other than that, I don't think I have a whole lot more to say about this topic. I basically covered what my thesis on UnitedHealthGroup is. So if you thought it was interesting, let me know. I'm not really sure. I'm trying to decide if I will still do another stream for the end of the year, because I know that people are likely to be doing holiday preparations or just other things, business or workplace Christmas parties and stuff. So it might be January for you. If I do, I'll announce it. If you guys have an idea, though, just comment on the video. But with that, I'll go ahead and end the stream.